Hey, welcome to session 3 of crisis counseling. Again, this is part of the training that's necessary for you to become certified as a domestic violence counselor, but it's also a part of curriculum for Vision International University. So in session 3, we're going to be continuing to focus on the process of how to intervene, or really how to be able to counsel people effectively in the midst of crisis. So the first thing we want to talk about is the concept simply of immediate intervention. You know, a crisis is seen as danger. And the person going through the crisis is going to have all kinds of emotions connected to it. It can seem quite threatening, and oftentimes we have a limited time in order to intervene in a healthy way. And so if you're called on the scene as a trauma counselor, as a domestic violence counselor, you want to engage with the individual that is suffering from the crisis as quickly as possible. So a person shouldn't be kept waiting. Especially if you think about it this way, if there's a physical injury, they need, especially if there's blood involved, they need immediate attention. You can't worry about how they feel so much, although you're cognizant that anything that you do to help them is likely going to be painful. But nonetheless, you do what's necessary in order to help them to become stabilized enough to move on to the next stage of their treatment and or life. So, but where possible, you want to get to the situation immediately, because people have a difficult time handling the stress of the crisis that they're experiencing. And so to try and keep them waiting for a long period of time is really not healthy. We've seen in many situations where people that were put on hold eventually become even more despondent and can act out. Even some suicide cases have been kind of the result of that, the lack of healthy intervention and immediate intervention. The person in crisis may also be quite overwhelmed and can become self-destructive, and so you want to try and, again, get involved with them as soon as possible. The sense of urgency, the oftentimes difficulty in understanding what's really happened to them and is happening to them lowers their normal ability to function, their normal ability to assess a problem and to come up with their own solution for it. So during the early phase, this earliest phase of where you're achieving a relationship with someone, you want to keep in mind that because of the stress, because of the anxiety, because of the psychological or physiological pain that they're experiencing, they may not be in the most rational state of mind. In fact, they can say things, do things that seem absolutely opposite to, or contrary at least, to wisdom. But that's what happens in the midst of a crisis. And so one of the things that you can provide is you come alongside of them as a counselor, and you begin the process, hopefully, of listening and listening carefully, is to reassure them that somehow, they're going to get through this. But your reassurance is not going to eliminate their anxiety, but it may tend to lessen it. Now again, you don't reassure them that, if they've lost money, they're going to get it all back. If they've lost a spouse, the spouse will come home. What you're guaranteeing them or reassuring them is that you're with them and they don't have to go through their crisis alone. So in that sense, you're coming alongside to encourage them in the process of expressing their feelings, dealing with their sense of helplessness, hopelessness, if that's what they are experiencing, and encourage them to take steps or behaviors that are going to be more health-focused and help them to get through this crisis situation. Of course, if you're dealing with someone that is suicidal and expresses that, now we'll look more about suicidology and what to look for and things a bit later. But if you are dealing with someone that is struggling with that, you want to, again, give immediate intervention into that situation. When you do that, you help to avert a more disastrous outcome. You know, the unsettling state of crisis is a tremendous opportunity for change. Again, that's not what you're stepping into this for. Gee, oh boy, I get to change somebody. No, it's kind of inevitable that change, either good or bad, is likely going to happen because of the crisis. But the person tends to be more open to discussing possible changes that they may need to make in their life. Because they are, at the moment at least, unsuccessful in coping with the crisis that they're experiencing, they might be open to new suggestion. So when talking either on the phone or in person, you want to hear the whole story. You ask for them to wait for, to ask them to wait for an appointment. I mean, it just doesn't work for most people in the midst of crisis. Yet at the same time, you can't get overly involved with them. It's a short-term, dynamic process where you become engaged with them, you develop quick relationship, you try and ascertain what the problem is, and then come up with their help some solutions that they can begin to act on to deal with the crisis in the immediate situation. So you want to help them to avert disastrous outcomes by making disastrous choices. Wrong decisions can often be made in the middle of a crisis, and so you want to try and help them not to make rash decisions, if you will, in the middle of that. Ultimately, you want to help people to take some action. People in crisis tend to flounder, and in terms of their ability to decide and then to actually act on their decision. So you want to help move them in a healthy direction. So you participate in that process. You contribute to ideas about things that they could do to make the situation better. So you want to help the person then to understand the crisis. I mean, what is the real issue here? What's the real problem? The real problem is not my mommy and my daddy dropped me on my head when I was a kid. The real problem is whatever the real problem is at that moment. And so in the crisis, you want to help them to deal with what is real in front of them, whether it's physical, whether it has to do with emotional trauma, loss, whatever it is they may be experiencing. And so in the early stage, the best thing you can do, I believe, is just kind of, come alongside. Come alongside of them. Have the ministry of presence with them. Really all that means is you don't have to say a whole lot. You sit with them, and with empathy, warmth, respect, honor, you ask them to tell you their story. What happened? What's going on here? What can we do to help? But the main thing you're going to do is listen, but listen actively. You listen to try and help them to understand what's gone on in their life and maybe what can be done to make things better. So you might ask some questions related to how the crisis has impacted their life in the major areas of life, in their work, in their family and friendships, and in their physical health, and even in their spiritual life. How has this crisis, this event, this loss, this trauma, how is it affecting you now? How do you anticipate it's going to affect you? These are the kinds of things that you want to help the person explore in the midst of the crisis. As you ask these questions, you're trying to ascertain which issues need to be attended to immediately and what can be postponed to a later time, whether you're a part of the later time or not. Because sometimes you will be. Many times when I'm called into a crisis, I deal with the immediate situation, and then the person realizes they would like to have continued care, and as a licensed professional, they'll choose to come to see me. Well, that's fine, that's their option. But many times you can be a part of the initial crisis, you intervene, help them see what the immediate problem is, and then you back away, someone else steps in and takes them for the next part of the journey. Here's an old Bible reference. It says, some sow, some water, but God gives the increase. It really doesn't matter how they get to the place of their increase or their restabilization as long as they get there. And it's nice to know that we can be a part of that process. So while the person is telling their story, we need to be patient and be careful with your nonverbal responses. I mean, you don't want to look shocked when someone tells you something about their life. Not that you want to be flat and stoic. You want to respond, but you want to respond again with non-judgmental empathy, warmth, respect, honor, kindness, love. That's what's essential for them, especially in the early stage of the crisis. So you don't want, you have to work through your own discomfort with things that people may talk about. And if you find that you're being called into something where you don't think you can handle it, like a trauma to a child. I mean, some people just cannot handle seeing a child hurt, wounded, or whatever. And so that's you. Well, be aware of that. That doesn't mean that you're disqualified from helping in other situations, but you don't want to be the person then to be on the scene dealing with that specific problem until you're able to develop a professional comfort, if you will, with that situation. Remember, the person is likely to be confused and a bit disoriented, so they're not going to be in their clearest thinking. So, things that are repeated, though, frequently, as they talk about the crisis or the loss, you need to hone into those things, because that is the making of a theme that you'll likely find in their life. So when someone says, everybody always leaves me. Everybody always leaves me. Well, again, who's the everybody? What happened is your husband, your wife, just left you. And you're experiencing the trauma of that. But what they're saying more than that is this is a theme in their life, and there's reasons for it. Now, in the middle of the crisis, again, it's not a thing of, you're not going to do intensive psychotherapy, but you want to be aware and kind of listen into those themes, because the next person, or if you are the one to do continuing care, that becomes the area of focus in trying to intervene and help for the future. So how much action should you take on behalf of the person is one question that many people that do crisis ministry ask, because we're big-hearted people. We want to help. We're in this business, whether as a volunteer or paid. We're in this because we care about people, and we want to see them do well. We want to see them get better. We want to see them whole. But you have to be careful. So only if the circumstances severely limit the counselee's ability should you take extensive action on their behalf. In other words, if possible, they should make the phone call home. They should take care of what they need to do in order to stabilize their situation. You don't want to do that for them if they're capable of doing it, because you don't want them to become dependent upon you as their primary caretaker. It's not a good place to be in. As counselors, we're here to be kind of catalytic, in that we come into a relationship, we offer ourselves, our insights, our listening ears, our conversation. We offer all of that for the individual for a season, and then but what we want to see is for them to take responsibility for their own life in every way possible. I mean, there's some times that you just can't do it. I mean, you cannot do something on your own, and someone needs to do things for you. But again, as a counselor, you want to be able to assess that, because you want to use wisdom when you're working with people. If the crisis is highly dangerous to the person or to others, or if the person is so emotionally overwhelmed that they can't function or take care of themselves, or if they're on, drug and alcohol induced, if they might possibly injure themselves, then you may have to take a more directive role. But again, where possible, you might be directive, but indirectly directive, if you will. You don't want to have to, again, take responsibility where they're able to be responsible for themselves. When a person is not a danger to themselves or others and is capable of making phone calls and running errands and driving and caring for themselves, then your role is really to help just simply facilitate and encourage them to take those steps necessary to be able to get back to healthy functioning. In crisis, the feeling that people have is often that of helplessness and hopelessness. And sometimes it's so strong in a crisis that they do what we often call yes, but. So you might suggest something to them. Like, why don't we, call somebody who can come and help? Yes, but they probably won't want to. Or I'm afraid to. Or everything is yes, but. Well, before you get into a yes, but game with people, you want to make sure that you are clear with them that that's not a game you're willing to play. That you're there to help. You want to help them to make some decisions, but this is not a game. This is not just getting attention. If you're in real crisis, I'm here to help, but you're going to have to help yourself where you can. So you want to encourage them at all times to take responsibility where they can and take action where they're capable. So this helps the person act from a position of strength rather than weakness. Because one of the goals is to help them develop not just a sense of stability, but also a sense of self-worth and self-esteem, that I can. Yes, it was a terrible situation, it was a terrible loss, or whatever the case may be, but I'm able to take some action on my own behalf. And so as much as possible, you want to, again, make sure that they're taking the responsibility, not you. You could ask how the person has handled things in the past, and that's often helpful, because many times they think, well, this is something that I have never faced and could never handle. But what you find is that they've been through other situations. They've been through other valleys in life. They've had other losses. They've had other injuries or accidents. And somehow they were able to get through. Well, if they've done it before, they can do it again. And that's part of what you want to encourage them to keep moving forward. It's like the old phrase, if you're going through hell, well, don't stop. Keep going. Keep moving in a healthy direction where possible. And the more a person does for themselves, the stronger their self-esteem is likely to be. So again, what we're looking for is to avert the catastrophe wherever possible and restore balance. It's no time to try and change the person. Again, they may be very open to change, but that's not your primary role in a counseling crisis situation. First, help the person to achieve some type of limited goal, something obtainable. To be able to just stand up, to be able to sit down, to be able to drink a glass of water, to be able to do something where they're taking a bit of control and using some self-motivation can really help them in the midst of the crisis. You want to foster hope and a positive expectation. Many times I'll have people say, well, you don't know what it's like. You're right, I don't know what it's like to be in your specific situation. But I do know what it's like to be in a crisis. I do know what it's like to have experienced loss. And though my loss is not the same as yours, I do know it's possible to get through it. And I know that because I've gotten through it. And I know many people have gotten through it. And I believe it's possible for you to get through it. Again, you're not giving them a guarantee. You're not giving them false hope. You're giving them a realistic hope. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy to restabilize your life and be able to move forward in a healthy way. But if you're willing to walk through the process, and again, we're willing to walk through it with you, you will get to the place where you can look back on the crisis, on the event, on the accident, whatever it is, and say, man, I'm glad I got through it. I certainly never want to do that again, but I'm glad I got through it. And I realized that though at the moment life was horrible, and I felt cheated, and I felt lost, and I felt hopeless and helpless, that in reality I can look back on the event and realize that, hey, maybe it's just, but for the grace of God go I, but we made it through. So if possible, you want to, not give, again, false promises, but encourage them in the process of solving their own problems. You want to find out if the person is able to see the whole picture or only selected aspects of the crisis. That's one of the things that often happens in the middle of crisis, is they get fixated, or they stay focused on just one thing. My life is horrible, my life is over because this happened. Well, really? It's not really over. I mean, you have all these other areas of your life that are pretty good. But when they get fixated on that one negative, I mean, it can become almost delusional. And to help them through it, again, you listen and you talk with them and you give them a sense of encouragement that you can get through even this aspect because you have so many other things going for you in life. So you try and help them work through their fears with the goal of developing a healthy equilibrium. So again, you want to, in the process, help them consider options that are open to them. Not every option is open to everybody. Consider too the consequences of decisions that they may make and how it might affect other people involved. Because many times people become so focused on their hurt, their pain, they're unaware of how they affect others in their lives. I mean, I've seen that many times when there's a husband-wife and there's divorce, especially if there's been infidelity in the relationship and they have kids at home, and the mom or the dad, I mean, they virtually crawl into a hole and they're completely oblivious to how this loss, this separation is affecting the children. Many times, one or more of the children will step up more into a parental role. Very dysfunctional, very unhealthy. So you want to help them to look at the bigger picture and help them to make healthier decisions, to examine choices and make decisions that will help the person to cope more effectively, not only in the time of the crisis, but moving beyond the crisis time. And so what we try and bring is good support to the person in crisis. And it's important for churches, for outside agencies, to be able to provide systems and trained people to help in times of crisis. This is one of the reasons for the course that you are taking, especially if you're doing this for the certification in domestic violence counseling, is so that you can be part of the community solution for problems when they arise. Again, when we're talking about domestic violence especially, we're dealing a lot with children. We're dealing with spouses, but mainly wives, who have been stuck in a cycle of abuse and neglect. And if we can break that cycle and rebuild them in a healthy way, if you will, it changes the community. It makes the community healthier. Healthier communities make for healthier communities. And so part of our work is to help people to deal with the crisis by providing the support to them in the middle of the crisis. Initially, you may be the only support the person has in the midst of their crisis. And if that's the case, well, that's the case. And you want to provide to them the best support you can possibly bring. But the goal is to integrate them back into a larger community of support and help. That's one of the reasons why we're very, very strong on healthy local churches, because they have people, which is good. They have caring people. They have folks that are willing to open house, provide food and meals and support in many ways. And so we connect with a lot of local churches. We connect with youth agencies who especially can help young people that have gone through loss, trauma, etc. We connect with lots of therapists that are excellent at being able to work with people, especially in dealing with the deeper issues that they have after the crisis has been dealt with. And so the goal is to really create community support in such a way that we can deal with the earliest stages of crisis as quickly as possible in conjunction with other agencies that get involved with people, whether it be police or child welfare, or whatever the group is, people that can come alongside and help in the midst of the crisis. Now, you're not always able to help. You're not always available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. None of us are. We have to have a life as well. And so if you're a caring giver, I mean, if you're really a caregiver, you want to be able to give care. You don't want to be a caretaker that is being so burnt out that when a crisis does come, you're not really able to engage in a healthy way. So you got to be able to take care of yourself in the process and recognize that crisis is crisis, and people are still people and always have been and always will be, and you never quite know what you're going to deal with when you come into a crisis situation. So I like to use the phrase, blessed are the flexible, they shall not be broken. So it's good to be flexible in the process of helping people in crisis time. Well, again, once the crisis is beginning to subside, you want to help with the building of healthy self-esteem. And part of that is recognizing that though you've had a crisis situation, a trauma, a loss, whatever it is, that doesn't define who you are as a person. Because many people feel a sense of a loss of identity because of my circumstance. I don't really know who I am. I don't know what I'll be if I'm not Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so. I'm just lost, and I feel helpless and hopeless. So it's necessary to help them to restore a healthy sense of identity, that they have worth, not just because they were a mother or a father, but they have worth because they're created in the very image of God. Crisis often forces people to face things about themselves, about their present, and about their future that they never wanted to deal with. Now again, I'm not saying that therefore crisis is good, but sometimes good things can come from some of the worst crises. Anyway, when someone's been through crisis, some people can get kind of stuck in that crisis. And all they talk about, they kind of define their life around the crisis. I've been with people that have had an accident, and so their whole life is before accident or after accident. They've been in a marriage, and they've gone through divorce, and so they define themselves as what life was like before or while I was married, and then now after. And but yet, life is much broader than that. But many people get stuck, and they get stuck in what we would call a grief response. They're not able to fully mourn or grieve as necessary to become more healthy and whole. So grief is a lot of what you're going to deal with in the early stages of a crisis response or crisis ministry. So I want to just talk about grief kind of somewhat briefly. If you're interested in getting a resource on that, we have a book called Grief Relief, which really expands all of this information, but you'll also see a certain percentage of it in your book on crisis counseling. But now again, no one is immune to grief. Eventually we all suffer from grief in many different ways in various forms. I mean, personally, I've been married. I'm on my third wife, which is kind of strange to even say, but I've buried 2 wives. I'm not sure either one of them wanted what happened to them. In fact, I'm sure they didn't. But that's life. But when I had to face the death of my spouses, it was not an easy thing. It was a very painful thing. And I experienced grief, an incredible sense of loss, and with it the emotions that go around with that. And what I found is that grief is not fun. In fact, it's bloomin' painful. And anyone that would tell you differently has either never experienced it because of the luck of the Irish, or they're just lying to you. I mean, when people say to you, well, gee, your spouse, they're in a better place. Usually the internal response for most of us is, well, I hope you join them soon. Because that's a terrible thing to say to a person. I mean, or God needed another angel, and so that's why they took your little baby, or your child, or your spouse. Please, please. Very insensitive, and very untrue. I mean, what I've found is that grief is painful, and in the midst of pain, we don't need anybody pointing out the pain, or poking us in the area where the pain is. So if you're a crisis counselor and you're coming alongside someone, especially someone that has experienced a significant loss, recognize that they're in the depths of serious pain. It may not be physical, but the emotional pain, the mental anguish that they're experiencing at that moment is just as significant, if not more so, than a physical pain. Many children will say, listen, I can handle a spanking, just don't reject me. Don't abandon me, don't betray me. Hit me if you need to. I'd rather have that. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should use corporal punishment, especially on kids where it's not done appropriately. But the fact is, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can destroy me. So we have to be careful when we're in the situation to come alongside someone and recognize the level of pain that they're experiencing. Grief is also directional. It's going somewhere. Now, it can go down, it can go deep, but it can also move someone forward. Grief moves naturally through stages if it's allowed to go through the stages. And grief is very personal. We'll talk about the stages in just a moment. Grief tends to move very slowly, unfortunately. And it's filled with all kinds of mixed feelings. It's amazing how many times I hear people say, it's not so sad I am, I'm so angry. Or I'm so afraid or frightened because of what happened. I mean, the feelings can be mixed, and sometimes they can introject those feelings, blame themselves for things that they had nothing to do with. Sometimes they blame others. Even the person that they've lost can be blamed. It's just a reaction. The mixed feelings are normal. In some ways, they're healthy unless they stay stuck on those mixed feelings for a long period of time. The pain and the hurt are the most common feelings associated with grief. Feeling empty expresses the need to mourn the separation, even though, we understand that separation happens. We understand that problems happen in life, but still, it's painful, it's difficult. There can often be hostility and anger, even directed toward God, toward people that are really helpful and caring. Again, the emotion is normal, and as a counselor, you may get some of that anger or fear or hostility projected on you. Again, have big enough shoulders and have a big enough heart to recognize the person is not mad at you. You're there to help, but they're just hurting. And if you can take that a little bit, take a little, you can, and you can help them. They'll eventually apologize. They'll eventually work things through, but you want to give them opportunity to express their feelings as they need. Guilt often comes with loss, but guilt is really a useless emotion. I mean, it comes down, a lot of it happens with the why questions. Why did this happen to me? Well, the answer is, I don't know, stuff happens. That's true in life. Stuff happens. You didn't cause it unless you actually did. I mean, there are things that you can, if you were driving and you were texting and you lost control of your car and you ran into another car and you caused bodily harm to another person, you did it. And you probably should feel some guilt and shame about your actions. But to hold on to that for a long period of time is unhealthy. You have to be able to somehow deal with the guilt, deal with the shame, and let go. We have to acknowledge that there is forgiveness. Certainly for those that have a faith orientation, I mean, the forgiveness of sin, of missing the mark, of doing something wrong is paramount to what we teach and what we believe. Thank God there's forgiveness, there's healing, there's restoration, there's reconciliation. And so, whatever the situation, whatever the loss, there's going to be grief, and there's going to be a time where they need to walk through the process of dealing with that grief through mourning. We talked about stages, and I just want to touch on these briefly. These are kind of a modification of the Kubler-Ross stages of death and dying. But I look at it a little bit differently. The first stage is often shock, and that's when we're called into the situation as crisis counselors. The person is absolutely, I can't believe this has happened to me.